It was a cold Saturday night, and there he was, flayed around like he was just thrown there on the shelf, waiting for me to take him home. Wait, pause.
What?
There I am at Walmart, out of all places, just looking for some props that I could use for something that's content related, for work, don't ask. But I thought to myself, okay, you know what, just for shits and giggles, let's go to the toy section. And I do know that Walmart generally does sell McFarlane's, except they're usually the shittier ones. They usually just have Demon, King Shazam, and then a couple of other stock McFarlane's that you will often see go for only about $10. They never really have anything that's generally rare or really worthy of checking out and taking home. Until that night, that just so happens that they had quite a few unique assortment of McFarlane's, and one of them was DC's Future State Batman Dark Detective, which is basically a reinterpretation of Batman and a reinterpretation of Bruce Wayne, in which he's going up against an organization called the Magistrate, and things went a little wrong, and he was believed to be dead up until he wasn't, just like in traditional comic fashion. But here he comes back with a grit and a vengeance, even more so than you usually expect Batman to have vengeance. Now, I will admit I'm not terribly familiar of this new comic line that debuted back in 2021, like literally just last year, but this is ideally the brand new take and look on that version of Bruce Wayne / Batman, where he's obviously going after a much more noir detective motif. He's obviously going to have that more rugged aesthetic, and rugged is he. I mean, he just kind of oozes and drips with style here as far as just how he looks. Of course, he's going to have the traditional little details that make it clear that this is in fact Batman that you're dealing with, including the cowl. But amongst looking at the cowl as well as the rest of the figure, you can definitely tell that this is a much more rugged, and like I said, it's taking heavy inspiration from those old school detective movies, only it's supposed to be taking place in a much more dystopian future. And of course, he's going to have those little characteristics that I really do like. He's obviously got more tactical versatility amongst his gauntlets, the cargo pants, or of course the different straps and the buckle that he's got going on with his utility belt. It looks a little, you could almost argue it's modeled almost a little bit closer to that of Indiana Jones. You even have a holster. Gee, I wonder if that holster will ever come in handy. But then you have, of course, the knee pads and the protective padding around the shins, the boots, that much tactical feeling, except with a much more brown aesthetic with the color palette. A little different than what you expect the Dark Knight to be. And because of that, I initially was a little turned off when I saw some of the promo shots finally unveiling this figure earlier this year. Now seeing him in person, he's definitely a lot easier on the eyes, especially the very stylized trench coat. The trench coat is actually molded and sculpted beautifully. I personally, however, don't know how I feel 100% about the little bleach aesthetic going on. I call it the bleach aesthetic. I know it's meant to be like dirt and grime to kind of give it like this really worn look, but it just didn't really translate all too well visually because it looks like my figure's bleached. I don't know if this is translated to every single version of this figure, every single stock unit, or if this is just an isolated incident with mine. And the reason why I'm a little paranoid that it could just be my particular figure that I just happened to come across that night at Walmart is because if we look a little closer amongst the chest area where he's got this tactical Kevlar looking kind of battle armor going around his chest, it's modeled and painted well except for, as you can see, the bat symbol. My OCD got ultra triggered when I noticed the spray painted bat signal. I like the concept, I like the look behind the signal itself. It's just that mine just so happens to be a little askew. You can see it's not necessarily all that centered, and I thought to myself, okay, maybe it's a style thing because it's meant to be a much more rough and tumbled Batman. But upon looking at some photos online, I deduced, like Dark Detective here, I deduced that that wasn't in fact the case. They actually mispainted my bat symbol. So if I do happen to come across this guy within the time slot of being able to either return or exchange my particular unit here, I might do that. I just might. Only because as of right now, as far as details and paint applications, that's the only one that's just kind of, like I said, triggering my OCD slightly. Because everything else is actually translated very, very well and interpreted really well in sculpting fashion. Going back to the cowl, I actually do like that the beard and the little stubble he's got going on actually looks like stubble. Maybe it's because this time it's actually molded into the plastic itself and into the rubber, because prior to that, most often when McFarlane tries to do like 5 o'clock shadows or things like that, it just comes off as like dirt just got scraped all over the face. But this time around, I don't know if it's because the fact that they kind of etched it into the sides of his face, or the fact that he's giving a grimace as opposed to the traditional scowl, and makes him a little stand out a little bit more in the intimidating side. Then maybe it just kind of comes across more favorably. Now, personally, as far as preference, I don't know how I feel about the ears actually poking out of the cowl itself. Of course, that's not so much a complaint on the McFarlane here, but more so on the actual look of the character in the comics, because I did see some panels that have him sporting this cowl where the ears are popping out. Makes them look a little too Captain America, or maybe, if we want to be a little bit more topical right now, a little too Soldier Boy. If you guys are keeping in line with The Boys debuting in the summer, I'm looking forward to that. But overall, I'm actually pretty pleased and pretty proven wrong, if you will, by how this guy looked, because I was just not vibing with him at all when he was first unveiled. What I was not prepared for was actually how the articulation was gonna throw me for a loop a little bit. In some places, it's actually pretty surprising in a pleasant way, and then in others, I'm like, never came across that particular problem before. Starting off with the head. So for those of you who I have seen in the comments complain about the fact that I like it when a head on a figure turns 360 degrees, is because of just the fact that it reaches that peak. It reaches that limit, which is frankly unlimited. The fact that it could rotate all the way 360 degrees. It doesn't have to, but I'm appreciative that it's there. So now you guys can take solace in knowing that unfortunately we cannot rotate 360. Well, actually, never mind. Yeah, we can. Okay, I'm sorry. Never mind. All right, there you go. We can rotate 360 degrees. This is, as you can hear, it's a little bit on the stiffer side. It's giving me quite a bit of resistance with the squeaking of the plastic, because initially, due to the way that this collar is kind of molded, I thought that it was just going to stop at that angle on both sides. And so I was able to rotate left and right, just not all the way. But upon further experimentation, rejoice, it is able to rotate. So I'm sorry, you guys are just gonna have to stick with it. It's also able to pivot slightly down as well as very generously up, except not as much as I would want it to be, but it's not too bad. It could also slightly tilt left and right, making his grimace all the more creepy if it's facing towards you. And then when we move to the shoulders is where things do get a little complicated, only because, as you can see right here, he's got this shoulder piece that's part of his trench coat that looks rather well as far as paint applications and detail. I like the little pleathery look. However, when it comes to actual articulation of the shoulder piece, especially with that butterfly joint, that is kind of conserved a little bit here. I mean, I know that it's in there. I can visibly see it. But unfortunately, because of the way that this whole piece is molded and the way that the trench coat is applied here, it's not really fully realized as much as I would want it to be. You can definitely rotate the arm 360 degrees vertically, but when it comes to extension, it kind of stops at a certain point until eventually the arm pops off, as you can very obviously see right there. Thankfully, it can pop simply back on due to that ball joint there. You can simply pop it, and giving it that sturdy press, it definitely pops back in swiftly, so you're good to go. But as I demonstrated there, extension is damn near impossible, because eventually these pieces right here start to kind of, I don't want to say scraped, but grip onto the top portion of his coat here, and it starts to slow it down to the point where all the force is now put on that joint, and eventually the arms are just going to pop off. I think the same thing could also happen over here. So as I try to do that extension, yeah, I get huge resistance once we reach that point right there. So it's almost able to give the full T-pose, but not as much as with other McFarlanes, unless you kind of swivel it this way. So the joint is still present, it's still definitely there. It's just not as fluid as with other figures because of the shoulder piece right here. So unfortunately, that is the case right there. The same could also be argued for the bicep swivel. So upon trying to swivel the bicep, it's separated from the shoulder piece, so that's a good sign. But it's also very, very difficult to do because eventually you see a little bit of interference with the shoulder piece right about right there. So when I try to do the swivel, it's moving, but it starts to come into contact with this rubber leathery piece, or it's what's supposed to be a leathery piece upon the shoulder there. So the same thing could happen over here, and it starts to slow down a little bit right there. So unfortunately, that makes it a little bit difficult, and because of that, I'm like, all right, I'm going to safely assume that if that wasn't the case, it would rotate 360 degrees like it traditionally does. But unfortunately, all of this is pretty much put on lockdown due to aesthetics, due to the way that this specific Batman is tailored. Now, thankfully, the two joints at the elbow are fully bendable, so both elbows can fully articulate all the way up, as you see right about right there. Unfortunately, the resistance of pretty much all of the aesthetic here comes back in the wrists. Once we get into the wrists is where, unfortunately, it gets limited once more because it can rotate each hand 360 degrees upon that ball joint inside, but almost every single time that I've tried toying with the hinge inside of each wrist, I virtually feel no movement whatsoever, either in either direction. So rotation's possible, but when it comes to like that hinging movement that I've seen other McFarlanes be able to do, it's frankly damn near impossible. Like, I just feel like the joint flexing, but I mean that in a bad way. I mean in the way that if I press any further, it's going to start creasing the plastic or potentially even breaking that joint altogether. So the arms are actually on the limited side due to the way that, again, this whole aesthetic is developed. I appreciate, like I said, the mood and the atmosphere that this Dark Detective Batman has given off, but didn't look like it all the way paid off in the articulation for the McFarlane. And we get to the torso joint, which is still there, but of course, as you can see, the paneling going around here with the armor is going to cause a little bit of interference. These pieces right here are separated, so you could get twisting left to right, but 360 degrees is going to be almost impossible due to the coat coming into interference slightly, as well as just overall the tightness of the figure itself. So it's not necessary that it has to be 360, but it would have been welcome. But you can see the joints flexing right there in the middle of the torso. No real waist articulation. Once again, similar to other McFarlanes, I could feel it kind of inching, but it's not really giving any kind of waist, so I don't want to risk breaking the figure whatsoever in an effort to find that. But he could kind of slightly crunch left to right due to the mid-torso joint. Just, again, not as much because of the way all this paneling right here is designed. Again, I like the actual texturing and the paint applications. I just wish that bat symbol were more centered aligned. Anyways, moving on. Besides that slight little grievance, we then get to the top leg joints. Now, the top leg joints are actually pretty surprising. You can definitely flex them forwards right here, as far as that right about right there, and almost as much as that far back before it starts to interfere with the rubber crotch ass piece, as it's typically found here on McFarlane's. When we get to extension, it's just as flexible as you would expect a McFarlane to be, only about that far right there with that traditional McFarlane joint. It's just not as ratcheted as other McFarlanes have come to be. Every time that I would always extend the legs of a McFarlane figure, it would always have a ratchet, a very satisfying click. It's there. You can see a little bit of pivoting as I kind of move it amongst that axis, but it's not as rigid. It's a little looser than I would like it to be. Thankfully, because of said looseness, I don't know if this was intended, but we actually have some swivel action, some double swivel action, if you want to look at it that way. Because not only can the top of the legs swivel almost on their own, not 100%, but almost on their own. You can see it kind of diagonally swivel at the top of each leg, right there. In fact, I would argue that maybe the right leg is probably the best one to demonstrate it on. But as I kind of swivel the leg, you can see right there, the top of the leg joint is swiveling. And then, if it wasn't already made obvious, you do have whole thigh cuts right there in the middle of the thigh that does allow the leg to fully rotate vertically in place 360 degrees. And then whenever you're ready to switch it back to its original position, you obviously got that plastic piece, this part right here that's designed amongst the thigh, this little cargo piece, protective area, kind of modeled right there to give you an angle of where it's supposed to be at by default. But when you do swivel it, you have the cut there and you have a little bit inching on right there. So at least a little bit of flexibility with the positioning of the legs, especially since this is probably the first McFarlane. I know a lot of you have said that McFarlanes are typically difficult to stand, and I attest to that, but traditionally. This is probably the one that has given me the most issues trying to stand them up prior to the review, so thankfully this swiveling action going around, whether it be the unintended on the top legs or the intended with the thigh cuts, is very welcome, because trust me, you're going to be utilizing it a lot. Then we get to the knees, which of course behind the knee pad right here, you could bend at the two joints all the way so that it's able to bend all the way upsides like that. Find it right there. And then as you navigate down, of course, you got the ankles. Unfortunately, because of the way, again, that all this protective gear is modeled, it is flexible. It's made out of this flexible plastic. However, the joint is not as bendable as other McFarlanes are traditionally made to do. You could definitely rotate it 360 degrees inside of the ankle horizontally, but when it comes to pivoting, it only pivots upwards only about like one notch, if you really want to look at it that way, and only about a couple notches, or I would even argue a notch and a half downwards. So as you can see right there, it's not really moving as much as I would like it, and that's probably where the most finickiness of the posability comes into play. That's where you're definitely going to have your frustrations getting him to be leveled when posing him. Then, of course, we got the toesies, except they're cut in a weird way where they're definitely flexible and articulated, but when you actually look at it aesthetically, you can see the feet right there being kind of etched out, so it kind of breaks a little bit of that illusion. I'm welcome to the joint, but when it comes to the way that they designed it, because of just how angular his boots are, because of that whole tactical aesthetic, it just looks weird when it's bending because it looks like his feet are being cut up. But to further prove my point, as I messed around with the articulation there for the sake of the review, trying to get him back into that pose, or at least in a tolerable stance, rather difficult. So you could probably argue it. Oh, there you go. Actually, that's not too bad. He looks, he's almost looking a little Wolverine-ish right there. Yeah, and I'm not just saying that because of the stubble or the rolled up sleeves. Honestly, I probably am, especially the gauntlets. I think this time around, the way that the gauntlets are designed, they kind of look like claws are gonna start coming out of it. That'll be pretty dope. But anyways, yeah, you're definitely gonna have to finesse with the figure, especially because I think the way that the stylized coat is kind of anchoring it that way, it's going to feel a little top heavy, and because of that, you're going to have to play around with the legs an awful lot more than prior McFarlanes you've probably already collected. Now, in terms of posability with any kind of accessory that they threw in, again, this is another area where McFarlane kind of left us wanting a little more, at least definitely left me wanting more, because they threw in this kind of grapple. I can't even call it a grapple gun because it's not even a gun. It's like a kind of like a rolled up sort of lasso, but with a grapple hook here at the end. I do like the sculpting going on behind the hook itself, and I like that it's flexible. You kind of move the hooks a little bit. I would have loved it even more if maybe we had some kind of joint here that was fully articulated so you can open up the claw inwards and outwards, and that would just, add some value, add some kind of premium quality to it, because personally, I never liked accessories where they're meant to be some kind of rope or some kind of cable, something like that, something tangible, but they went ahead and rolled it up and molded it this way. I don't know what it is, but I never liked accessories like this. I know that the unmasked McFarlane Catwoman from the new Batman movie, she's got her whip, but it's not fully extended. It's coiled up like this, and I kind of get it. I get it. It's for the poses, for certain poses, for him to have him in that way, but for me, as far as personal preference, either give me the grapple gun with this coming out of it, or just give me a batarang or something that's a bit more true to character. Outside of this, it's kind of okay, kind of an okay accessory. There's not much paint application going on right there. And as far as him utilizing it, one of his hands is by default a fist, so obviously he's only going to have the one choice to actually hold it in this position. And because of the way that one side, I would argue that this side over here closest to the grapple is molded a little thinner, that's arguably going to be the one to properly fit into his hand. So there you have him. And as you kind of finesse once again with the legs, because I touched them, and that did the number of trying to get all this situated in the right way, or else he's going to start toppling over. You see that posability is a little limited, only because him posing with his legs alone, because of all that rigidness, along with just the fact that the accessory is not a whole lot of fun to play with, Dark Detective Batman here left me a little puzzled in the end, because the ways that he surprised me were genuine surprises, whether it be his aesthetic, his design, his overall look, because that's honestly one of the things that I was complaining about in the first place. But then when it comes to the departments that I usually have quite a bit of trust in McFarlane, such as the articulation or posability, that's where I was frankly kind of let down. So DC Future State Dark Detective Batman here is kind of a mixed bag, so I was pretty happy that I was proven wrong in the areas that I was getting a little skeptical and rather judgmental, I'll admit. But then in the areas where I thought to myself, okay, we're definitely gonna be able to handle articulation and posability and accessories just fine, is where I was left wanting a little bit more. And I'm hoping that maybe the rest of the Future State wave is gonna be able to meet those expectations. Granted, it still fared off better for a figure that I wasn't initially going to purchase in the first place. I'm therefore going to mark this case as solved, and if you guys want to pick up your own DC Future State Dark Detective Batman, be sure to utilize the links in the description to help out the channel quite a bit, and of course, check out this other McFarlane toy review showing up on screen for more. As always guys, take care, stay humble, and I'll see you on the next one.